This is an easy piece quilt from the book Weekend Quilt. Mine took more than a weekend, but that is because I worked on it bit by bit, a couple of hours here and there. The first thing you have to do is wash, dry, and iron all of your fabric. Make sure that it's ready to go. Here I'm cutting 2.5-inch strips. I'm using a rotary cutter and folding the fabric to make the cutting really quick and efficient. Make sure you have a straight edge before you start cutting. But it's a really efficient use of fabric. You really don't throw very much away. This pattern is called a fence rail pattern, and it's got a dark color and a medium colored strip that run all the way through the quilt, and then there's light colored spaces between them. So you have to sew the strips together. I just used a 5/8, I think, inch seam allowance. And once the strips are sewn together, you iron them flat. Make sure that you're ironing your seams open. And then the strips are cut into squares. So again, it's just a really efficient use of fabric and time because you're making whole strips at a time. As far as the sewing goes, so you're going to sew these two blocks together, and then without separating the thread, just keep going. So you're going to sew a whole row all in a big long line and then cut them apart later. This is just efficiency, saves time. To make sure that I got the pattern right, I did lay it out on the bed beforehand. I did get a sense pretty quickly of how the pattern was laid out, so I didn't have to lay out the whole thing. Once all of my strips were sewn together, so sets of 2, I did lay the whole thing out on the bed just to make sure that I hadn't made any mistakes in the pattern. And then I used pins for the first time actually to pin the long strips together. This is just so as you're sewing those long strips together, they can get twisted and you can kind of lose track of where the pattern is. At this point, I have more or less the whole quilt blocked out. You don't cut any of the threads yet, and so it kind of holds the whole thing together. At this point, I've sewn my long sides together, and now I'm sewing the long sides together to make the short sides. And it's time to iron again and just make sure that the seams are all open, that it's nice and flat. I usually iron it from both sides so that it's nice and clean and flat. At this point, my quilt isn't quite big enough for my queen size bed, so I cut some really wide borders, some 6-inch borders, and sewed them around the outside in 2 different colors. And that gave me the extra fabric I need to cover the queen size bed. I like to use a recycled blanket for my stuffing. This is something that already exists. I'm keeping it out of the landfill, and it is much cheaper than buying stuffing from the store. You do have to baste your quilt together at this point, so you're basting the outer part, the blanket or the stuffing, and I use a sheet on the bottom. Again, it's cheaper and it's recycled. The basting is super important when it comes to machine quilting because you're having to shove the quilt through the arm of the sewing machine. Pins are going to get tangled and pulled out and lost, and so it really has to be basted at this point. I just do straight lines down between every other block and then turn it 90 degrees and do the other direction. It's all ready to go pretty well now, except for the binding on the outside. So I just used a little bit more leftover fabric and cut on the bias so that it would sit really nicely. And then ironed my binding folded in on both sides and then in half like bias tape. The binding gets sewn onto the outside of the quilt and then folded over and sewn down. I do everything on the machine. I don't use hand sewing at all when I'm quilting usually. It's just faster. It's all beautiful when it's hand done, but then you are not going to be able to complete it in a weekend. When I'm doing the binding, I'm really careful to check underneath every now and again and make sure I'm catching both sides so that it's all nice and tight. I had some little bit of leftover fabric, so I took some old pillowcases, made some matching pillows, and there you go. I hope I've inspired some of you to give it a try. It's easier than it looks, I promise, and all you need is a basic sewing machine and a rotary cutter and a mat. Will save you a lot of time. There's a ton of patterns online for easy sew quilts, and give it a shot.